Welcome to the Customer First Thinking Podcast, Episode 19. My name is Stephen Shaw, the host of this podcast. In this episode, we interview Scott Brinker, the VP of Platform Ecosystem at HubSpot and editor of the popular blogging site chiefmartech.com. Up until roughly a decade or so ago, most marketers felt ambivalent towards marketing automation. Too complex, too hard to get help from IT, not in their job description. But they certainly viewed it as indispensable for mail campaigns. So the technical work of pulling data, creating lists, and targeting customers was usually left to a services provider. All of that changed with the dawn of big data. Suddenly, marketing automation became crucial for success, even more so when omni-channel shopping became ubiquitous. Gartner famously predicted that CMOs would eventually outspend CIOs on technology. And sure enough, technology now accounts for the biggest slice of marketing budgets at 26%, greater even than media spending. Yet, technological complexity remains the main barrier to progress, especially now that the principal mission of marketers is to make the customer experience as seamless as possible across multiple touchpoints and devices. Marketing technology has certainly come a long way over the decades, evolving from the standalone CRM systems of yesteryear to the monolithic enterprise marketing suites of not so long ago, to the cloud-based platform ecosystems of today, when there is an app for just about everything, including apps to connect the apps. What hasn't kept pace, however, is the technical acumen of marketers, no matter how digitally savvy they may be in their personal lives. Too few organizations have reached the stage of maturity where they're graduating enough marketing technologists to take command of these wobbly Frankenstacks. And too many marketers are still reliant on their IT staff to do the heavy lifting, the customization work, the application integration, the system connectivity, and so on. Which is probably why marketers struggle to make optimal use of their current platforms, citing complexity as the top challenge. Nowadays, most companies have opted for a single vendor solution as their marketing platform of choice, whether that's Adobe, Salesforce, Oracle, SaaS, or any one of a dozen other competing systems. But as Forrester observes, these are still made up of, quote, separate components deployed simultaneously. Often, these platforms have to be augmented by multiple point solutions, usually in the range of 5 to 20 different applications, which perform specialist functions such as social media management, sales enablement, event management, survey deployment, and much more. And of course, these platforms also need to be tightly connected to various internal systems of record, which store the precious source data. The integration of all these various systems has always been a challenge. No wonder then that the vast majority of marketers lack confidence in their ability to deliver a truly unified experience. It's just too complex. Recognizing the problem, the major Martech vendors are broadening the scope of their platforms, seeking to natively integrate as many third-party applications as possible connected through open APIs. The goal? Personalization at scale. And making the integration of these disparate tools even easier are so-called no-code development platforms that allow even non-technical users to create unifying processes across different applications using drag-and-drop interfaces. HubSpot, the inbound marketing platform, is a great example of a hub-and-spoke system, with hundreds of third-party tools from certified partners, helping to make their solution one of the simplest to deploy with minimal involvement by IT for any small to medium-sized business. The executive in charge of the platform ecosystem at HubSpot is Scott Brinker, best known as the wizard behind the chiefmartech.com blog, who specializes in demystifying the world of technology for marketers. His annually published Marketing Technology Landscape now features a total of 8 8,000 solutions, up from a mere 150 10 years ago when he first produced it. The author of Hacking Marketing, Scott's an astute observer of the fast-evolving technology business and was once a co-founder and CTO of a successful interactive content developer before selling it to Toronto-based Scribble Live several years ago. His blog site, Chief Martech, serves as a window on the intersection of marketing and technology for 50,000 readers, a consistent source of thoughtful perspectives on the state of Martech. I began the interview by asking Scott why he chose to make HubSpot his new home.
So I think one of the things that was very exciting for Ion is we got it over the 10 million ARR mark, which in, SaaS businesses starts to become like a threshold where you're demonstrating like genuine product market fit. But I think, myself and my co-founders, we were kind of the classic entrepreneurial, founders. And this was the first time, we had a SaaS business that was, hitting that rate of growth. And so, what we were actually looking for was a strategic partner who would be able to bring to us like a lot of just, the scalability associated with, building up sales forces and, reaching broader markets. And so, we had very high expectations that Scribble Live was going to be able to do that. For various reasons, Scribble Live had a bunch of its own challenges that they ran into after the acquisition. Nothing to do with Ion, I'm happy to say, but it didn't. The story did not continue the way I'd certainly hoped it would. But how I got into HubSpot was, for this blog I'd been writing for a decade or so of, chiefmartech.com. One of the themes I kept coming into was this growth of all the apps in the Martech landscape, right? I'd had that crazy chart. And believe me, that chart took off in ways that I would have never predicted when I began. But so one of the things that, was really challenging for marketers was they had all these apps that were being created, but the major systems that they relied on, sort of their foundation of their Martech stack, most of them didn't have really good integrations with these apps. And so I actually spent a number of years kind of complaining that, hey, listen, it's crazy. You should have companies like HubSpot and Adobe and Oracle. They should be like embracing this as a platform ecosystem opportunity and not, like trying to just compete with all of it because, you just can't compete with all of the things happening there. And so I kept complaining about this loudly enough. And then the founders of HubSpot like actually reached out and they're like, all right, well, you want to put your money where your mouth is and like help us make this, more of a true platform. And so, for me, that was an opportunity to, not just comment on the way I thought the industry should go, but at least with one company be able to hopefully contribute to making that happen. So it happened that the timing of that was at the same time that, Scribble was acquiring Ion. And so the transition just happened to work out well, but that was a year of many changes.
As you mentioned, you've had your blog going, Chief Martech, for over a decade. I've been tracking you, I think, virtually that whole time. You've kind of become the market's de facto translator for marketers, helping them keep up with all of this technology. Was your motivation, just going back to that period, to help educate the general marketer and what the possibilities and potential were of this whole very fast evolving landscape? Or were you more interested at that point in taking dead square aim at, this new breed of marketing technologists that were starting to infiltrate the workforce?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a little bit of both. And the way they connected is, when I started writing that blog, I'd always spent a number of years with basically like a digital agency, one of the precursors to the Ion Interactive SaaS business. And so we'd get hired by marketing teams, and then I'd lead a tech team that would then have to bridge the understanding with the client's IT team. And there was such this gap between IT and marketing. Some people called it like a hostility between them, but to be honest, I don't think it was so much hostility. It was just they just lived in completely different worlds. They didn't understand, what each other was trying to do, the incentive structures, the language. And so the idea of the Chief Martech blog was to say, listen, if you could start to bring more technical talent into the marketing organization, marketing would be able to better, collaborate with IT, but also be able to better manage its own outcomes with all these tools. And so it was interesting. On one hand, I was talking to the CMOs, the non-technical marketers, to be like, listen, you really need to develop these capabilities in these organizations. You don't have to be a technologist yourself, but you better start to, build that capability in your broader team. And then as that actually started to happen, I found myself, as kind of the champion of this marketing technologist, professional, and so I started to dig deeper and deeper into that content. Yeah. But the original goal was this isn't technology for technology's sake. This is, how does marketing adapt to what is, quite frankly, a radically new environment compared to what it was 20 years ago? And a phenomenal environment, a great environment. It's such a wonderful time to be a marketer, but there's a lot to learn.
Yeah, it's the most interesting field I think you can be in today for the very reasons that you described. We're going through this whole transformation and transition. Keeping up, though, is hard. I mean, it is a full-time job practically.
It's hard for me. I love this stuff. I'm as deep and I can't keep up with all of it.
So. Your passion comes through in your writing, and also you're quite visionary. I mean, you're able to synthesize really well. Let me touch on one thing, because we're moving at this phenomenal pace on a number of different fronts, clearly, and customer experience is risen to the top of the corporate agenda, I think largely as a result of this crisis we're currently experiencing, this pandemic. And marketing, is no longer an island anymore, right? It has all of these causeways to different areas of the company to actually deliver against that promise of a customer experience. So I'm just curious about your blog now. Do you see and I've noticed it somewhat in your editorial coverage changing, do you see that audience widening to encompass other areas of the company that actually have some full or partial responsibility for the customer experience?
Yeah, so I think in actual practice, that is very much happening. In fact, actually, there's been a lot of data this year that for a while, for the past 5 years, there was this really, in fact, maybe even more than that, there was really this trend of marketing taking over more and more technology on its own and actually relying on the IT department less and less, which was probably a good thing at a certain stage, because marketing really did need to take more ownership of the outcomes. And they just couldn't shrug it off. They really had to understand this stuff. But what's been interesting is, I think this year in particular, we've started to see a lot of data of now that transferring back, where, the IT department has a much bigger role to play, with the technology that marketing is engaged with, for the exact reason that the technology is no longer just for marketing. It's technology that really does need to enable, the broader organization. And while there are definitely still pieces of this that are unique to marketing, this idea of these platforms and, enterprise architectures that connect all the dots is a lot of growth. I would actually say I haven't done a very good job on my blog of even speaking to those broader audiences yet. So that's my bad. But, actually out there in the world has very much the trend I see.
Well, it's hard because it's such a work in progress. And I mean, you reference IT. I used to joke that the organization only moves at the speed of IT, which isn't very fast. It's glacial. And that's held marketers back from, I think, really realizing and taking advantage of some of these technologies. And then it's I think in your book, Hacking Marketing, you reference the Hemingway quote, change. Well, he refers to bankruptcy, but you could refer to change. I think that's what you say in the book, that change is gradual and then it happens all of a sudden. That's what we seem to be experiencing, this massive leap. And I would say particularly in this past, in the year of the plague, we've certainly seen that.
The year of the plague. Well said. Oh my God, I will be so glad when this is behind us.
Oh my God. Well, maybe the year and a half of the plague.
Yeah. We're not out of the woods yet, but I see light at the end of the tunnel.
So, but just to go back to my point, the whole now impetus behind digital transformation seems to have added some fuel to organizations' determination to overhaul that infrastructure and pay more attention, in fact, to that direct to customer relationship. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's one of the things I've looked at before was what I felt was this paradox of this accelerating pace of technological change, and yet from an organizational change perspective, just nowhere near the exponential rate that technology has moved, and that's actually been a terrible conundrum. I mean, like everyone feels squeezed by that. But I think one of the things that's been really interesting in 2020 is the expectation of how quickly could an organization change if they really had to. I think it's been remarkable, how many organizations have adapted significantly, in such a relatively short period of time just to deal with the crazy, circumstances they found themselves in. And while I'm sure none of us want to repeat 2020, and the circumstances that got us in there, I think there's a lot of lessons that, we will take away from this year about how perhaps we are a little bit more, we have the ability to adapt and change more than maybe we gave ourselves credit for, back in 2019.
Well, I guess it's organizational culture. Most businesses, I suppose, are just fearful of, or they're risk averse, let me put it that way, and don't you really see the need to change what seems to be working. And then this crisis comes along, they realize, well, maybe it's not working as well as we thought it would work. So, but the vision thing is interesting, and I want to come back a little later, if hopefully you have some time for this, in terms of organizational structure and how you see that changing. I do want to, but you did reference what I think you earned a place in marketing heaven, in my view. You're a master of the 2x2 grid. When you introduced Martech's law, as you called it, where you postulated that technology changes exponentially while organizations change logarithmically. And it was a wonderfully incisive observation. I looked at it at the time and went, oh my God, that's useful. And of course, I immediately started to crib that and use it in client presentations.
Excellent.
Can you, but just for our broader audience who may not be acquainted with Martech's law, can you just take the time to explain it exactly?
Yeah. So if you imagine, a graph and you've got two curves. So one curve is the pace, the rate of change in technology, which is generally like it's an exponential curve. It rises up and very far to the right, and even if you're not a technologist, you've probably heard of things like Moore's law, how like computing power more or less doubles like every 2 years or so, right? That's an exponential growth curve, but we see it in so many other, dynamics. I mean, like even, like what we're doing here together, creating this, video podcasts and stuff. I mean, right, this, technology, has advanced so much, in such a relatively short period of time. So yes, very cool. Technology changes rapidly. But then, yeah, if you look at a separate curve of like, okay, well, how quickly do organizations change? Like their processes, their internal structure, incentives, the sort of like makeup, the culture, all those things. Now or companies change, but they tend to change very slowly. I mean, or change management is like a whole field unto itself for very good reason. I mean, it's hard to do this and hard to do it at scale. But then if you take those two curves and you juxtapose them against each other and you see like, okay, this technology curve is like moving up and to the right super fast. And the organizational curve is kind of like, dragging along far below that. The distance between the two just keeps getting wider. And I think that does capture the sensation that so many of us have felt, over this past decade of like, the things that are happening around us and our ability to react and adapt to them just feels like woefully, mismatched. And I think a lot of people like take it personally. They feel like, oh man, I just don't get this, or my company just doesn't get this. And one of my takeaways from Martech Law was actually trying to reassure people that it's not you. I mean, this is like pretty much everyone, is wrangling, with this, I have 1 foot on this ferry and 1 foot on the dock, and like the two things are going in opposite directions. It's
well, and there's a whole bunch of reasons for that, as we know, and ranges from the board having very few members of marketing on that, or any marketing background on that board, not really seeing the vision, and that cascades obviously right through the organization, as we know. In this past year, as we were just talking about, though, do you see a sea change occurring now in the willingness of businesses and the conversations you're having to effectively accelerate innovation and get ahead of change instead of always chasing it?
Yeah, I mean, like I think basically what happened this year is incredibly stressful for everyone. But basically, you were told like change or die. And I don't mean like change or die in some sort of like 5-year, 10-year curve that's, like the frog in the boiling water, myth. And like, oh, well, it's getting hotter all the time, but any given day, it's not that much different. No, this year is basically, it was like, sudden, it's like, okay, just all these other channels we had for finding, engaging, with our customers, they're just gone, And so if we don't like come up with some other way, like we're not going to make it through the quarter, much less the year. And so I think that really forced people to have to make change. And they did, and I don't think any of us want to go back to this kind of a scenario where like, okay, the new approach to change management is just hold a gun to everybody's head and say, change now. Very uncomfortable. But at the same time, again, I think like we've now demonstrated that significant change in a relatively short period of time is possible, and so I think it puts into our toolbox the ability to think moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, when the house is on fire, obviously you've got to put it out somehow. But I think the other side of the equation is if the house isn't on fire, what's the motivation to invest in innovation unless you see that change looming ahead? And isn't the problem in most organizations that vision tends to be lacking? No one has an innovation department. It's a collective responsibility. And when it's a collective responsibility, it's no one's responsibility. So that marketing technology adoption seems to go hand in hand with that vision. I mean, am I out of step there? I mean, I see the DTC companies clearly, anybody without legacy systems and processes and thinking, but changing that thinking in organizations is a tough one.
Yeah, totally. Although, again, I think like it was interesting. So when the pandemic hit, you could have bucketed companies into two categories. There was a set of companies that, quite frankly, were already very digitally savvy. I mean, not just in how they engaged with their customers, but even like how they would operate internally. Like the ability, like HubSpot, where, I work, HubSpot had actually, for the previous year, really been leaning into supporting remote work because it was a way for us to bring in talent from a much broader pool, worldwide. And so as a result, when the pandemic hit and we, everybody had to go to remote, all the systems were in place and the rituals and the mechanisms where it was frankly hard to tell the difference in the way work was actually getting done, from pre-lockdown to lockdown versus, a set of companies who they just had never implemented any of those capabilities before. And it's to their credit how many of them implemented it in a relatively short period of time, but it was really, really painful. And I'm hoping that part of the lesson here is, the reason we want to invest, in some of these changes before we get into a, life or death situation for our company, is because, it might be another pandemic, or it might be a brand new competitor, or it might be some change in regulation of how we engage with a particular customer group, or it, might be some hot new consumer technology. I mean, whatever the disruption is, we don't know exactly what it's going to be, but if we can, advance, for some of these capabilities, it will let us adapt as the changes happen, whatever they may be.
Well, it is interesting because there are plenty of undercurrents and trends that are, portending immense change ahead of us. And it's not up to the technology folks they can figure out emerging technologies, but to marry that to a change in the business model or significant changes in strategy, whose province is that today? And if not marketing, who, right? So, and I think that's the other issue I see is marketing, unfortunately, many organizations that I see lack the gravitas to really take on that challenge. And so there's a bit of a vacuum in organizations from what I can see between the need for that visioning and then the delivery mechanisms to really achieve that, which takes me to another question. You also won fame, obviously, and you alluded to it earlier with your marketing landscape infographic, which I think you did the first one back in, 2011?
Yeah.
There were 150 vendors, I think, on that infographic, as I recall. Your latest one has 8,000. Soon you're going to need an outdoor billboard to list them all. What accounts, this is a loaded question, I apologize for this in advance, what accounts for this astounding, 5,000% growth?
Yeah, it's I've spent a lot of time wrestling with that. So I think at the end of the day, there's supply and demand for any market. And basically both sides, are contributing to this. So from the supply side, I actually think that is perhaps the more significant one, in the sense that it used to be 20 years ago, if you want to start a software company, like, you need to get a bunch of capital. There's these long development cycles. You had to, then figure out like a go-to-market through all these like traditional expensive channels. People then would have to like install your software in their data centers. That was, multi-year. It was really hard to make a software business 20 years ago. And if you fast forward today, where now, everything's in the cloud. You've got, like Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure or Google Cloud, like all these things that make it super cheap. Like I can be in a coffee shop and in a matter of like 10 minutes, like spin up world-class global infrastructure, for an app. For a matter, it costs me less than, the coffee I'm buying at the, coffee shop. All these open source toolkits that people are standing on the shoulders of giants. And then even from a go-to-market perspective, digital marketing and all the advancements there have made it possible to say, okay, well, I can target a very specific segment and I can reach them, relatively affordably. And so all these things have basically essentially made zero barriers to entry in the software market. And you don't have to have the ambitions to build $1 billion software company. You can be like a couple entrepreneurs who like, listen, if we can solve this problem for this niche and, have a $10 million business, oh my goodness, that'd be amazing. Like those kinds of businesses just weren't even practical in the software space before. So that's changed. But, again, like supply is only one part of it. You actually have to have people who are willing to buy it to, have anything happen. And I think this is where, there's been so much net new opportunity for how companies and marketers like engage with audiences. And frankly, that environment is continually shifting. Like even if you just look at all the, like social, tools and networks and it's just constantly exploding. And so there's always these opportunities for marketers to say, oh, I'd like to experiment with this, or could I try this? Or could I have something that's really targeted for the way my particular audience engages with me? And so all these things combined, they kind of create a relatively fluid market where there is a lot of supply and demand. It can operate at a much smaller scale, than before. And then, software companies, they don't die, right? Some of them do. So, some get acquired, some truly go out of business. But frankly, the ongoing operating costs of these cloud-based services are so low that, you have a lot of these tools like, okay, they were built for a specific purpose. They got a certain amount of traction with a set of customers who like it. And they maybe never grew beyond that. But that doesn't mean that they're going away next year. They might stay in that mode and they might have their happy set of customers, for like 5 years, 10 years. So all this feeds into, what's been a very expansive landscape. And I will just say one last thing is, it isn't just marketing. Like, so marketing is what I've studied and I've seen this dynamic in Martech. But we now see the same dynamic across, like fintech and, sales tech. And this is just cloud
retail e-commerce, Shopify, those, we can go on. And that's been an interesting development in and of itself, and very representative of the type of platform economy that you've been writing about, which again, I go back to this this conundrum: is 8,000 solutions out there, mind bending, continually changing, continually expanding. One presume, although there might be some contraction this year. Is there a need at this point to step back and say, you know what, it's not all really about marketing anymore? This goes back to the point I was making earlier. Maybe I need to categorize these solutions. I'll take you one good example is the content marketing space in of itself is very confusing. All types of niche products serving different ends of the spectrum there. Uberflip here in Toronto is a good example of one aspect of that, and there are others. Is at some point do you stop expanding the list and really recategorize it? Is that maybe the next step?
Yeah. So you're kind of like reading my mind here. So we're just getting ready for 2021, and I'm like, for like 2020, it got to the place where I had to hire a team of like 9 people that we spent 3 months working on that landscape. And I'll be honest, at some point I'm like, okay, I don't know if the effort that's being put into this is worth it. Because let's face it, that landscape, it isn't really useful for actually doing anything with it. I mean, it's a conversation piece. It's a way to like appreciate the scale of this industry, which, then maybe feeds into how you think about, some of your approaches and your strategies. But you don't actually, I hope to God nobody's like actually using the landscape as the way to throw darts and pick technologies. And so I do find myself wondering okay, well, maybe we can just at this point in time retire it and say, listen, we all agree it's a huge market. There's always going to be thousands of these things.
Well, except that your database that you've now created, that's hugely useful. And I could think of a lot of ways you could expand that to make it actually a very valuable tool for people, a tracking tool or an evaluation tool, if you will.
Yep, that's definitely an option. And then also, what you said, which is to say, is there an opportunity to, instead of trying to do it all at once, even maybe do a more like category by category? I think you're absolutely right. Content marketing is great. Like I have this one big bucket for content marketing on that crazy landscape. And you're absolutely right. I mean, the number of things that are in there and how different they are from each other and their relationship to each other. I mean, right, none of that is being captured there. And so if you were to just do a landscape just focused on content marketing and then all the categories and subcategories within that, I actually think that would be a much more useful tool for people to understand, okay, this gives me a much better sense of what's actually happening in content marketing capabilities.
Well, and it's an interesting conversation point because I think if you look at the current state of the enterprise marketing suites today, to some extent, they've almost backed into that, haven't they? I mean, Adobe is digital experience and SaaS is analytically driven marketing and, acoustic is, I don't know what acoustic is. It was interesting. IBM dumped but it obviously has a mission in mind. And I could go on. SAP is still very much operational marketing and so on. So to some extent, that, if you will, roadmap is playing itself out in real time here.
Yeah, I think it's just hard for large companies with very expansive, software footprints to cover all of the use cases, within it, which is, again, kind of like the fundamental reason why I think the platform strategy is the way to go, is because you do want one unified platform. You don't want all this stuff living in these, fractured silos. But from a capability feature perspective, there's a lot of specialization that you want to, support. I mean, you mentioned Shopify. I think they're a fantastic example of this. Okay, so Shopify, for the platform they're selling, they're obviously doing a phenomenal job with that. But within their app marketplace, I think they've got something like 5,000 apps listed in it. So we talk about my Martech landscape, oh my God, 8,000 Martech things worldwide. Heck, you could argue there's 5,000 things just specifically for Shopify. And it's one of Shopify's strengths, because it's not like a typical merchant is going to scratch the surface of all 5,000. But whenever they want a particular little piece of something, they can probably find it somewhere in that market.
And very quickly they can do that. It was a great piece in the New York Times, not last week, the weekend before, on Shopify. And it described this, the writer actually set up a location-based business in no time at all using Shopify platform. And she herself was a software engineer, so she was quite impressed by the speed at which she could actually then bring in these widgets, bring in these other sort of mini applications to expand the capabilities of her platform in no time at all. So to your point that you were making earlier, that is the explosion, and you write about this, the explosion in those apps out there it's becoming a galactic reach of value out there that we just have to figure out what it makes the most sense for our individual businesses. Everything's possible now is basically the story.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting. So I remember, so I've been in the software business for a long time, many, many decades. And I remember, in the 90s, I was involved in a number of deals that were trying to get VC or stuff like this. And there was this saying that used to go around of oh, that's not a product, that's a feature, and it was this very dismissive sort of thing of yeah, that's not some multi-billion product. That's a little feature that should live in some other product. And it was treated as a negative versus I think, if you look at this current state of modern platforms, in the cloud age, and Shopify is a great example. They've got a marketplace of 5,000 features and it's friggin' awesome. And you've got people in there who have created some features that are so valuable. They're running a multi-million-dollar business just from that one feature. And so I actually think, it's it is a feature instead of a product. And friggin' is great,
So let me, there's a few other questions I want to ask you around just that landscape, but I do want to just switch to another great artifact, by the way, that you produce and it's part of your Martech conference, is the Stacky Awards. That's a hilarious title, where just for our audience's sake, you invite people to illustrate in quite creative ways, their particular version of a marketing stack. Now, at the same time, Gartner says that most users are pretty happy with those stacks, but not taking advantage of full capabilities. I think 60% say, yeah, I'm taking advantage of full capabilities. Why do you suppose that is? Why do you think that they go out and acquire, assemble, piece together these stacks, and in the end they don't use half of what they have? What explains that?
Yeah, so I actually have a counter perspective on this, which for what it's worth, I think utilization is the absolute wrong metric to measure for this, because who cares? All right, so I bought a new car a few years ago, and the car has the ability, I've been told, to go up to 120 miles per hour. I just don't go anywhere. I live in a little neighborhood where the maximum speed limit I end up, being around is 30 miles per hour. So am I looking at this and feeling okay, well, I've really underutilized this vehicle? Well, yeah, I guess you could say that, but the vehicle does everything I need it to do. It does it wonderfully, and I love it, and I enjoy it. I'm getting the outcomes I want. I kind of feel with MarTech, there's so many capabilities that get built into these products, which is awesome and it's wonderful. But frankly, to say, if one particular marketing team only needs some subset of that to be able to execute what they want, does that mean oh, well, if I'm only using 40% of the features in this product, then it was a bad choice? Because I don't think that works. Don't get me wrong. I do think, if there are things you should be doing, if there are things you feel hey, listen, we could actually improve our outcomes, with acquisition or customer success or happiness if we leverage some of these new capabilities, and you're not using them, then yes, I think that's fair to say, okay, let's look at, how we solve that problem. But this abstract thing of utilization, I'm just who cares? What matters is outcomes.
Yeah. No, and I think it's probably because you take the traditional IT mindset, which is all cost focused. I think, and overlay that on that, you can see why somebody makes those kinds of conclusions. But there is this expression of Frankenstack, right? where you're just adding stuff needlessly and creating, all kinds of additional complexity, which I think takes me to my next point. Forrester says that the number one issue with marketing technology, the critical factor in its success is integration. It's the number one driver. Doesn't that suggest that simpler might be better, that less is, in this case, less is more. And does that also then back into an argument that actually you should be looking at suites as opposed to best of breed? What's your philosophy around that?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of really good things that are all entangled there, and I think, yeah, the integration problem is like right. That's couldn't agree with that more. Again, this is kind of what got me into the work I'm doing with HubSpot. Is I don't think this integration problem should be the problem it is, right? Like, I mean, I've got, I don't know, like dozens of apps, on my iPhone. I just other like anytime I want one, I can get it, and I know it'll just work, and the UX it kind of fits in, and the feature, and I don't have to worry about like, oh my God, is this data not secure? And that one. I mean, don't get me wrong, B2B, like marketing stacks, B2C marketing stacks, they're not as simple as, a mobile phone platform yet. But asymptotically, like, there's no reason why they shouldn't be, right? I mean, like, if these platforms design, the right sort of extensibility and APIs, and the people who are creating the other specialist apps adhere to them, these things should plug in. Integration should not be the barrier, that it has been. And I think, like if you're basically having to choose between, well, I buy one product where everything works together, but it doesn't do exactly what I want, or, oh, I have to buy a whole bunch of products that in theory will do exactly what I want, but I can't get them to work with each other. I mean, that's a terrible friggin' choice to be presented with. Like, neither one of those scenarios is great. I guess you could argue, well, if I can't get the integration to work, then I can't ever take advantage of those best of breed features. So, yeah, sure, just give me whatever you get in the suite and I'll just be unhappy with it. But like, why should we like limit ourselves? Like, why can't it be a platform, that then basically you can plug in specialized functionality? Again, the example we just talking about with, Shopify, and get the best of both worlds. And so, yeah, you're adopting stuff only because, hey, I need this capability. And if I try the capability and it doesn't perform the way I want, I can pull it out. It should be a lot more fungible than it has been.
So it's an interesting challenge, and there is another one too. And and this may get solved in time. And we're going to talk about that, I think, shortly. But a few years ago, we went through ourselves, our company, an exhaustive review of all of those platforms as they existed at the time. For example, one of them was Marketo, and of course, they got swallowed up. But we looked at Salesforce, Redpoint, Marketo, Adobe, the gang of six, and I have to say it was mentally taxing. And I'm reasonably close to it. I went in at least to that project with some familiarity with the underlying systems. Comparing them, contrasting them, figuring out what differentiated one from the other. I think it all came down at the end to figuring out who was going to provide the best onboarding service. It was so complex, which takes me to a point I think you made in your book, Hacking Marketing, where you say, I'm going to quote you here, that complexity is the greatest operational challenge of modern marketing. Your book was written, 4 years ago. Would you still argue that complexity is the number one challenge here?
Yeah, and it's going to get more challenging for a whole bunch of reasons. But again, this is something where I feel like we can fight this tide, and it's not a big part of this is the responsibility of the Martech vendor community. Again, I just think, the platforms and app developers, we could be a lot better at this, and I do think the industry is moving in that direction. I do think it's improving, but I also think we've got a considerably long ways to go because, right, I mean, the full range of all the things that marketers might want to do with some sort of software mediated capability is just infinite. And so if you're having to make the decision for that whole range in like one main decision of like, I don't know, do I get all these like 5,000 features from Salesforce or all 5,000 from HubSpot or all, like, yeah, oh my God. And once I make that choice, I'm stuck with it forever. Yeah, it's like, yeah, who wants to be in that situation? If you could be in a mode of saying, listen, I'm going to make a choice of, iPhone or Android because, there's a subset of reasons why I prefer one or the other. But then I retain the freedom after I've made that choice to, at whatever pace over time, pick up other little apps that I plug into it and not have it be such a big deal. I mean, again, I know that's a simpler world than the world we're living in with, business tech stacks. But I think we should be aspiring, to make it more like that.
But I think so. I'll just make the example that we were faced with, because our primary constituency in our company, or the marketing op folks, are actually executing on campaigns, if to use that rapidly antiquated phrase. And in their head, they had a mental model of the workflows that they would follow to execute. And the question that they kept pushing back on was, how can I do this using that? And is it the challenge to flip that question to say, how can you change what I'm doing that for the better based on your platform? And that conversation by all of those vendors was mostly about, how can we fill your needs? Here's not how we can change the business outcome for you.
Yeah, I have mixed feelings to that. I feel like on one hand, yes, right? Like, the vendors should be in a position of helping to educate and empower marketers to do better than they've had before, right? Like, here are things we will enable you with our product that, with a little bit of rethinking, your organizational side of this, your operational side of this, you'll see these huge gains. And you see this. I mean, this is one of the reasons why, Salesforce has that whole Trailhead program and HubSpot has its whole academy, is because I think the vendors recognize at the end of the day, helping to teach marketers how to really harness the value out of these tools is a winning formula for everyone. That being said, there's this kind of nerdy thing in computer science called Conway's Law, which is it basically says, like, okay, if you have, like, software reflects the team that built it. So, like, if you have, three different teams building a piece of software, you end up with a software that has like 3 stages, or, because that just, software reflects the teams that build it. I actually think there's an inverse to Conway's Law, which is like, for those of us who buy software, very often we get forced into changing our business to match the preconception of how the software creator thought we should run. And that may not actually be a good thing, So you have to be a little bit careful, like, okay, who's driving the ship here? Is it me as the CMO, or is it like, this marketing vendor who, God bless him, had a great idea, but frankly, it doesn't fit well with my particular organization.
I mean, the sinking of the Titanic in the business was the CRM field in the 90s, when so many of those systems floundered because people simply rejected the implication when those systems were adopted of, I have to change the way I do stuff. And, Salesforces were, of course, in those days notorious for that. So go back to this question of complexity, and it's not just the technology that's complex. It's the managing what we call here the unified experience with customers. Those are easy words to say, darn difficult to pull off. There's inherent complexity in having to manage now these anytime, anywhere interactions we're having with customers. The old days of pushing a messaging out through email and just dealing with the response paths that follow is one thing. Now today, it's mesmerizing. How does anybody even be able to engineer an experience around all of the possible options of the way people interact with you? Isn't that at the heart of this challenge of complexity we're going to have going forward?
Yeah, and just to add a little bit of fuel to that fire, what's actually going to make it a lot more complex in the short term is, frankly, all these things with like AI and machine learning and automation, that basically before, the number of things we could have simultaneously operating in our digital environment were sort of constrained by like the human contributions to that. So there was kind of an upper bound on just like how much of this stuff could be like running at the same time. Now, as we are like embracing more and more automation and AI, like the number of simultaneous things that are feeding in data and reacting to data and analyzing the data, making decisions based on this is, rapidly getting out of control. And so I do think, this is going to be a very big challenge in 2020, the 2020s. In fact, I've been recently writing it in like, okay, I feel like the past era was about big data. How do we get our arms around, like all this data that's coming into our organization? Versus like, I think now the next challenge is going to be what I call big ops, which is like, how do you manage the operations of the business with like all these operational elements all running in parallel? I think it's going to be challenging, but I'm an optimist. I think in some ways, the very kinds of software that help create this problem are also going to be some of the ways that we get through this. I think there is going to be like another layer of technology that is really focused on helping us govern and manage and monitor all these other technologies and translate them back to us in a way that, we can regain some positive control.
Well, to your point, expecting, a pilot who learns to fly a Cessna to step into a modern jet today and then fly it is pretty unrealistic. AI, just as a jet plane flies today in an very automated way where pilots virtually don't have to touch the controls, I rather expect that's the future, or AI, that's the real value to me, that AI will relieve the complexity for marketers going forward, managing all of the, the idea that a marketer can sit there and plot out the interactions in some decision tree and then, drag and drop through an interface to figure that out. It just that those were the presentations that we'll be giving those vendors a few years ago when we were meeting with them. We're going to have to have a whole different paradigm shift there. I do want to get into a jump into the deep end of the pool now that we're warmed up.
And now we get to the hard questions.
It's a hard question for me. It's not a hard question for you because you've written about this extensively recently, and it's fascinating. And you talk about this second golden age of Martech and the rise of platforms and platforms within ecosystems. And it's horrendously confusing even to somebody mildly acquainted with the subject. Maybe you can, for the audience, again, sort of simple, because the thinking is so profound here. Can you simply simplify that concept for our audience? What do you mean by that second golden age of Martech?
So I would argue that in the first golden age of Martech, which we've come out of, and let's face it, if you have an explosion of 8,000 different vendors and everyone's got, marketing ops team, this was a explosion. This was a golden age. But it's interesting that I feel like the golden age was largely framed with three dichotomies. We were talking about this earlier, like suite or best of breed. You have to make a choice, and the trade-offs, associated between that. The other two were software or services. You'd have companies that were software companies, and you'd have companies that were services companies, but nothing in between. And then the third was, these decisions of build versus buy. Do we buy a commercial product and just live with that? Or do we build our own from scratch and then take all that overhead? And to be honest, those three dichotomies have been really painful. It's like you look at those choices in a lot of cases and you're like, well, kind of, I want a bit of this and a bit of that. And I really do believe this is what this next age, what I would call then the second golden age of Martech, is instead of, suite versus best of breed, platform ecosystems, which is to say, have a kind of a Swedish platform as your foundation and then augment it where you needed with best of breed features that sort of plug right in. For the services software, thing, I think we already see, software companies that are now offering more services because, if you can't make your customers successful with the software in a subscription-based world, this results in something called churn. But also in the other direction of services companies who, we talked earlier about how there's no barriers to creating software, that now you've got services companies that are realizing we can actually make our offerings more efficient and more effective and more differentiated by bringing some of our own magic, bottling it into some software that's probably likely going to be offered in combination with our services, but it becomes, a more sophisticated offering. And then in the build versus buy, again, this kind of gets us back to platform ecosystems again, which is to say, listen, you don't want to invent your own mail sending, protocol level. Nobody needs another one of those. What you want to do is a platform that gives you like, all of this commoditized capabilities. And then you want to create your own little custom apps on top of that are very, very tailored to either the operational flow or the customer experience that is unique to your business. And so I think those three things combined, it's actually, you can tell I'm an enthusiastic and optimistic individual, but I really do think this next 10 years is going to be a pretty amazing time frame in marketing.
Well, and I couldn't agree with you more. And it's an interesting intersection too. And we're in the marketing, our company's in the marketing services business, and we do end-to-end experience management to, really make it easy for our client to be hands off and not have to worry about it. Just basically give us our marching orders and hit the go button. But go back to exactly what you were saying it's that, what we're starting to see, and you pointed out in some of your articles, are services being created around these platforms where it's fully integrated, and the hard thinking, which is experience design, gets done by that services company and is obviously in sync with the client or, what the ask is, and then is able to bundle that all together in a fully integrated solution. That, to me, would be really accelerate this, what otherwise might be a very painful transition period, citing 10 years ahead, but off a lot of pain along the way to get there.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, again, at the end of the day, this is all about like, how do we make this easier and better? Certainly for businesses, but then, through that for their customers too. And I think the good news is, we look at a lot of the challenges that we've wrestled with for these past 10 years, and we say, yes, this has been painful. But if you really look hard at all of them and you're like, okay, well, could this be better? The answer is, yeah, actually it could be better. And it's not a tremendous amount of rocket science. I mean, it's not an effortless cakewalk either, but we can get there. I mean, if we can put a man on the moon in like 10 years, I mean, surely we can get some Martech apps to integrate in like a decade.
I mean, it's crazy. Your career started in the early 90s, and I was actually running a marketing technology services company back then when client server was basically being uncrated, and drag and drop interfaces were coming in, and I look with wonder and amazement to see the amount of change since then. It's been absolutely unbelievable. I want to cover two areas that I think are important, and one of them is marketing process is one. You're a real advocate for agile marketing. But agile to me also spells tactics versus strategy, and maybe we can have a little bit of conversation around that, back to the vision question. And then the role of IT in all of that. Is IT a frenemy today? Are they an enabler? What's that relationship between the two? So for marketing to achieve change, it needs to change. And it needs to change the way it thinks and its processes, et cetera. And IT, obviously as well to some extent. How or who drives those marketing process changes? This is back to, does technology lead or does process lead? In the case of marketing going forward, to manage this unified experience, how does marketing just rip the covers off these old processes, which is push, 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 and adapt to this new world, which is basically marketing in the moment in a lot of cases?
I look at it as a kind of classic triangle where there's technology and then process, and then we'll call strategy the third piece of that. And the technology side, really at the end of the day, it amounts to a set of technical capabilities. Things that, okay, we may not. It's a big question of how we'll leverage those capabilities, but the technology gives us a set of capabilities. And then the process is very much about how we operationalize that. But I think the piece there that ultimately makes the difference is, the strategy of like, okay, so what? How am I orchestrating, those operational processes and, those technological capabilities into something that actually delivers value, to the business, to our customers. And so, yeah, I'm definitely a big fan of like, these agile management processes, because I think they're a particularly good framework and methodology for dealing with rapidly changing environments and being very adaptive and very helpful for like learning and experimenting. They sort of set up a structure that's designed to encourage and support that. But I'll be the first to say there's nothing about agile marketing that's strategic. Agile marketing is sort of a process mechanism by which you can implement, strategy. To a certain degree, it also can become a mechanism to feed back to strategy, some insights, from those experimentations. But yeah, the people who say like, oh, well, you're either agile or you're strategic, it's like a false choice there. You're like, no, you should be agile and strategic. This is possible. But then, yeah, for the capability side of it and the IT side, yeah, I mean, I think there's a high variance from one company to another today because what has happened is marketing has changed so much. Frankly, IT has changed so much, and so in any given organization right now, the particular combination of, capabilities and talent, and process and how that's split across IT and marketing. I've seen every variation, of this, and some that are working great, and some that are like a total disaster.
That's a perfect segue, because then for me, the corollary question is this: is Martech governance? Is there a requirement here to relieve marketers of the pressure of having to think about all this stuff and create a marketing technology office that takes that load off them, sits there between IT and marketing as sort of the Switzerland of the company, and arbitrates, what do you need? What can we deliver? What makes sense in terms of the IT infrastructure? What do you see working out there? Is that a shared function? Is it sort of a hybrid thing? Is it run by committee? What model have you seen really functions well in terms of establishing an MTO?
Yeah, I think it's challenging because you're conflating two reasons you would want a group other than marketing just wholly running its own technology. One reason is because you want some governance. You want okay, I want to make sure that we're, staying compliant, with data and privacy laws. I want to make sure that the SLAs of business performance are in place. I want to make sure we do the security reviews so that this stuff doesn't create big gaping holes, and so kind of like how the finance organization, has some very strict governance that it applies to how the rest of, the departments in a business, use money and spend money. IT, I think, has a very powerful role of providing a high level of governance over the technology used throughout the org. So that's one reason you want that. The other reason you want it is what we were chatting about earlier, which is to say, okay, it isn't just a governance thing. It is an operational thing, because there are some of these technologies that we want to operate across multiple departments. We don't want our customer system of record to be siloed in the marketing department. It needs to be able to work across marketing and sales and customer success and feedback into ops and finance, and so IT is, again, like a perfect organization, to run that common platform across those teams. That being said, there is an incredible set of stuff that happens specifically in marketing that I just don't know if, having a team in IT is close enough to the actual execution of okay, well, how do I run an influencer campaign? Because if you're going to talk to me about owning the technology to manage influencer campaigns, I mean, how much do you actually understand of what those things need to do and how they're going to work and how we're going to learn them and experiment and try? Again, that doesn't mean hey, there should still be governance to make sure if you marketing implement that, influencer marketing solution, we're going to vet it for, security and compliance and performance. And we're going to require that it integrates to the key systems we need across the company. But on the other hand, I just don't think IT wants to be in the business of actually doing marketing operations work.
No, probably not. And I think maybe what I was suggesting earlier is that you have an MTO office that's really a hybrid creature, if you will, that understands the marketing lingo and the tech lingo. And, as opposed to hiring a marketing technologist to step into the marketing department, report to the CMO, there's a dotted line relationship there to the CIO and the CMO. And that, they now there may be a next generation of marketers that come along that potentially solve this problem where, they're already aware of what those influencer solutions are, and the ask is go out and find the best one, as opposed to saying, well, I really need to pursue influencers, but I don't know how to do that. I rather expect that problem may solve itself in the long term. Or if your audience keeps growing and people keep coming to you for the answers, you can point the way for them, I think, in terms of...
Funny, that whole, like marketing technology office concept. So that was actually where my blog started. In fact, the reason the blog is called Chief Marketing Technologist is I was like, oh, well, you'd have this team that crosses between both of them. And what was interesting is as this marketing technology movement really started to take off, it moved under marketing. And I think, one of the reasons why is because like one dotted line and one solid line, you can make work. When you have something that's almost two dotted lines, it's just hard. And still today, even while I think IT and marketing understand each other much better than they did like 10 years ago, still in a lot of companies, the incentive structures between IT and marketing are still very different, like what they're being held accountable, up at the rest of the C-suite. And so again, I worry like if you get something that's too much in the middle. I mean, anything's possible. I actually have seen companies that even implement that today, but I think it's certainly harder than I expected it to be 10 years. Like this is one of the dimensions of like organizational structure that I didn't have as much experience with when I was first like, hey, how about we just have this group in between the two? But I've now come to like appreciate, well, there might be some good reasons why not to do that.
The real politic of it is, yeah. So, and just associated with that, because, we're out of time and this time is just absolutely flown by. Data is the new gold, and clearly that's a hackneyed phrase, but true. But yet a third of data that's collected by organizations today actually doesn't get used. It's certainly not optimized, and there's all of the oversight that you were referring to earlier. Is there a requirement, in addition to a marketing technologist, to have a data czar who wraps their arms around this precious resource and helps every part of the organization figure out how to make the most of it?
I think that's helpful. In fact, I guess you've seen now, like there are these chief data officers, that's become a bit of a thing. Yes, and I kind of feel like that is probably a role that is better affiliated with the IT department, partly because I think it ties into a lot of the governance issues, and then partly because, right, we probably want to think of that as a resource that isn't owned by a single department. It's something that's actually, empowered across the whole organization.
Well, and isn't that the knock on CDPs, customer data management platforms, for people who don't know what that means? That they're great. They can provide the marketer with a unified customer profile, but they too are disconnected from other data repositories that could add value. So, and I think Gartner says those are about to enter a trough of disillusionment. I don't know if that's true, but certainly data in the end is, well, if we're going to be data-driven marketers, becomes really the alchemy behind this, isn't it? Scott, this has been an amazing conversation. I could talk with you for hours. I'm just going to watch your I think it's monthly video casts that you've got going on now, which are really good. So I encourage my audience to go to your site, Chief Martech, and track, because it's the best resource out there. You still basically own that field. I haven't come across anybody like you. So, amazing work that you do, and I'll continue to follow you. So thank you. Thank you for being so generous with your time today, too. It has been a lot of fun talking to you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Very, very kind. This has been a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate all the great questions on this. Yeah, there's a lot of cool topics. So thank you.
That concludes my interview with Scott Brinker. As we learned, technology continues to grow exponentially, while marketing keeps falling further behind, held back by legacy thinking, antiquated processes, data fragmentation, and internal silos, which get in the way of unifying the customer experience. But as the technology becomes easier to use and the pool of technically astute marketers grows, the complexity challenges of the past will almost certainly be overcome. Technology will act like a tractor beam, pulling marketers into the future. We are on the verge of a new era in Martech. After decades of false starts, unmet expectations, disillusionment, IT resistance, underutilization, and futile attempts at integration, marketing will have reached the promised land, user-friendly technology which can be harnessed to transform the customer relationship. You can find past episodes of this podcast on customerfirstthinking.ca, where you'll also find articles, strategic frameworks, video, and more on the transformation of marketing. In closing, a big shout out to Justin Eacock for his contribution to making this podcast happen. Until next time, thanks for listening.